I guess the handyman finally figured out which door the guests use. The words floated across the marble lobby just as I stepped through the revolving doors, carrying the garment bag that held the only suit I still wore on special occasions. Laughter followed immediately, not loud enough to admit they meant me, but loud enough to make sure I heard every syllable. My hand froze on the handle of the bag. I looked down at my polished boots, my neatly pressed white shirt, and the silver watch my late wife had given me on our 20th anniversary. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready, because today wasn't just another family gathering. My only son was getting married. Yet within 5 seconds of arriving, I had been reduced to the help. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like this remind us that the truth has a way of arriving exactly when arrogance believes it has already won. I slowly raised my head and found the woman responsible. Vanessa Hartwell smiled as though she had merely shared an innocent joke. Beside her, her mother, Claire, hid behind a polite grin while several guests suddenly became fascinated by their champagne glasses. Nobody defended me. Nobody challenged her. That's the strange thing about public humiliation. Most people don't participate. They simply watch and wait to see what you'll do next. For a brief moment, I considered turning around and walking back through those glass doors. I was 64 years old. I had buried my wife 5 years earlier, spent 4 decades building the family farm my grandfather fought to keep alive during the worst drought this county had ever seen, and raised my son with one simple lesson. A person's character mattered more than their bank account. Standing in that lobby, I wondered if I had somehow failed anyway. Then I felt a hand rest gently on my shoulder. Dad. I turned and saw Darius. His face was calm, almost too calm. He glanced toward Vanessa, then back at me. Trust me. Just tonight. 4 simple words. No apology, no explanation. But there was something in his eyes I had never seen before. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't fear. It was certainty. The kind of certainty a man carries only when he already knows how the story ends. Before I could ask what he meant, he gave me a slight nod and walked back toward the ballroom as if nothing had happened. I stayed because my son had never once given me a reason to doubt him. Even so, the rest of the evening felt wrong. Vanessa greeted guests with effortless charm, accepted compliments about the wedding, and played the role of the perfect bride. Yet, every time she looked in my direction, I saw the same expression she had worn in the lobby. Not hatred, not anger, but quiet contempt. She looked at me the way investors look at an old building scheduled for demolition, useful only because of what stood underneath it. At the time, I believed she was simply judging a widowed farmer who didn't belong among wealthy developers and luxury hotels. I had no idea that the joke about the handyman wasn't meant to embarrass me. It was the first crack in a plan that had been unfolding for nearly 2 years. Before this wedding weekend was over, my own son would place evidence in my hands, proving that the woman standing at the altar had never fallen in love with him at all. And when that truth finally came out, nobody in that ballroom, including the Hartwell family, would ever look at this wedding the same way again. I barely slept that night. Vanessa's joke kept replaying in my head, but what disturbed me most wasn't the laughter. It was how natural it had sounded, as if she had been thinking that way about me for a very long time. Lying awake in my hotel room, I found myself drifting back to the afternoon almost 2 years earlier when Darius first drove her through the front gate of our farm. I remember wiping my hands on an old shop towel after repairing a tractor when his pickup rolled into the yard. The young woman who stepped out smiled warmly, shook my hand firmly, and thanked me for inviting her. She was polished, confident, and knew exactly how to make a good first impression. I remember thinking my son had found someone intelligent, someone who seemed capable of building a good life beside him. That was all any father could hope for. I welcomed her without hesitation. I walked her around the property, introduced her to our neighbors, and even showed her the pecan grove my father planted decades earlier. Most visitors asked about the age of the trees or the history of the farmhouse. Vanessa asked different questions. She wanted to know exactly how many acres the property covered. She asked where every boundary line ended. She wanted to know whether the creek flowed year-round, whether mineral rights had ever been sold, whether nearby landowners had received offers from developers. and whether the county had discussed any future infrastructure projects. At the time, I convinced myself it was simply professional curiosity. She worked in commercial real estate, after all. Those were the kinds of questions someone in her profession might naturally ask. Still, something about the conversation lingered with me long after she left. A few weeks later, I met her parents for the first time, and that uneasy feeling quietly returned. Preston Hartwell carried himself like a man who expected every room to revolve around him. Every sentence sounded less like conversation and more like a business negotiation. Claire Hartwell was quieter, but somehow even harder to read. She smiled often, complimented the farm repeatedly, yet every compliment was followed by another question about ownership, taxes, maintenance costs, or long-term plans. Neither of them ever insulted me outright. People like the Hartwells were too experienced for that. Instead, they had mastered something far more effective. They asked questions that subtly reminded you your world wasn't impressive enough for theirs. Had I ever considered selling? Didn't maintaining 32 acres become exhausting at my age? Wouldn't retirement be easier somewhere closer to the city? Every visit seemed to circle back to the same subject without ever appearing intentional. Darius never noticed because he was happy, and I refused to become the father who criticized every woman his son dated. More than once, I almost shared my concerns with him, but each time I stopped myself. Losing Lorraine had changed me. Since her death, I questioned my own judgment far more than I questioned other people. She had always been the better judge of character. Whenever someone smiled too perfectly or agreed too quickly, she paid attention. More than once, she protected our family from trusting people who turned out to have hidden motives. Standing alone in that hotel room the night before the wedding, I realized something that made my stomach sink. Lorraine would have recognized Vanessa long before I ever did. The problem wasn't that I had ignored warning signs, because they were invisible. The problem was that I had seen every one of them and kept inventing reasons to explain them away. By the time I finally admitted that possibility to myself, it was already too late. Or at least, that was what I believed. I still had no idea my son had spent the last several months proving that my instincts had been right all along. The engagement dinner finally ended a little after 9 that evening. Guests drifted toward the elevators, waiters cleared away half-finished glasses of wine, and the ballroom slowly emptied as though nothing unusual had happened. I wanted only one thing: to return to my room, take off my suit, and forget every second of that miserable evening. I had almost reached the hotel entrance when Darius caught up with me. "Dad, can we talk somewhere private?" There was no hesitation in his voice this time. Whatever he had wanted to tell me earlier, he was finally ready to say it. We walked together through the parking garage until we reached his pickup truck. The moment the doors closed, the noise of the hotel disappeared. Darius didn't start the engine. Instead, he rested both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield for several long seconds. I had known my son his entire life. He wasn't buying time because he didn't know what to say. He was preparing himself to say something that couldn't be taken back. Finally, he reached into the center console and pulled out his phone. "Before I play this, I need one promise," he said quietly. "Let me finish before you say anything." I frowned. "You're starting to worry me, son." He nodded slightly. "I know. That's why I need you to hear everything." I gave him my word. He unlocked a folder on his phone. Instead of family photos or wedding plans, I saw dozens of audio files arranged by date. There were recordings stretching back weeks, each carefully labeled as though someone had been building a case instead of planning a marriage. My confusion deepened. What is all this? Darius looked directly at me for the first time since we entered the truck. "The reason I asked you not to leave tonight." Without another word, he pressed play. At first I heard only the sounds of a restaurant's silverware, quiet conversations, glasses touching. Then a familiar voice broke through the background noise. Vanessa. She sounded completely different from the woman everyone had admired inside the ballroom. Relaxed, comfortable, certain. 6 more weeks, she said with a small laugh. "After that, everything gets easier," another voice answered. Claire Hartwell. "And Darius?" Vanessa laughed again, almost amused by the question. "Darius is the easy part." My body stiffened. Every instinct told me I had misunderstood. Surely there had to be another explanation. Then Vanessa continued. Once we're married, I'll start working on the property situation. Dad already has buyers interested. My heartbeat seemed to echo inside the truck. Property, buyers, marriage. None of those words belonged together. I turned toward Darius, waiting for him to stop the recording and explain that this was some terrible misunderstanding. He didn't. Claire's voice returned. What if his father refuses? Vanessa answered without the slightest pause. He won't. Men like him trust their sons. That's what makes this so easy. The recording ended, but the silence that followed was even louder. I couldn't find the words. My mind kept replaying those last two sentences, trying desperately to force them into a meaning that wasn't there. After nearly a minute, I finally whispered, "Tell me, that's not what it sounds like." Darius slowly shook his head. I wish I could. He opened another folder filled with screenshots, scanned documents, emails, and photographs. How long have you known? I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. He leaned back in his seat and exhaled heavily. Long enough to realize tonight wasn't the beginning. It was only the first time they stopped pretending in front of you. Suddenly, Vanessa's joke in the hotel lobby no longer felt like a careless insult. It felt like confidence. The confidence of someone who believed victory was already guaranteed. Every strange conversation during the past 2 years flashed through my mind. Every question about my farm. Every overly polite smile from Preston. Every rehearsed compliment from Claire. For the first time, those memories fit together perfectly. But even then, I still believed the recordings were the worst thing my son had discovered. I was wrong. Darius looked at me with the same calm determination I had seen in his eyes earlier that evening, opened one more file, and quietly said, "Dad, this is where everything changes." Darius didn't say another word. He simply opened the next file. At first, I thought I was looking at an ordinary county planning map. Colored lines crossed several properties, survey markers dotted the landscape, and a thick blue corridor stretched diagonally across the page. Then he zoomed in. My breath caught in my throat. Sitting directly in the center of that highlighted corridor was my farm. Every acre, every fence line, every tree my father and grandfather had planted over 3 generations. What exactly am I looking at? I asked quietly. Darius enlarged another section before answering. A proposed highway expansion project. I frowned. I've never heard anything about a highway. Because the public wasn't supposed to. He opened another document marked as a preliminary planning proposal, followed by internal engineering estimates, environmental studies, and acquisition schedules. Some documents carried official county seals. Others were clearly confidential drafts that had never been released. The deeper he went, the colder I felt. If this project is approved, Darius explained, the land along this corridor could increase in value 8 to 12 times within a few years. For several seconds, I couldn't respond. 32 acres had never represented money to me. It represented birthdays beneath the pecan trees, my father's worn boots hanging beside the barn door, my late wife's flower garden, and every sunrise I had watched from the front porch. To me, it was home. To someone else, it had become an investment, waiting to be stolen. Suddenly, every conversation Vanessa had ever started came rushing back. She hadn't asked about acreage because she admired farming. She hadn't cared about water rights out of curiosity. She hadn't questioned future development because she found county planning interesting. Every question had been part of an inventory. She had been measuring the value of something she believed would soon belong to her. Darius opened another folder. This one contained emails exchanged over many months between developers, consultants, and investment groups. One name appeared again and again. Preston Hartwell. My jaw tightened. He's involved in all of this? Darius nodded. Not just involved, he's helping coordinate it. My stomach turned. I had spent nearly 2 years believing Preston was simply an arrogant businessman who looked down on people like me. The truth was far worse. He had never been interested in getting to know our family. He had been evaluating an acquisition. Darius tapped the screen once more. A scanned document filled the display. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I saw my own name printed across the top of the page. Raymond Cobb. Below it sat what appeared to be my signature authorizing preliminary discussions regarding the transfer of development rights. I stared at it for only a second before shaking my head. That's not my signature. I know, Darius replied. Another document appeared. Then another. Proposed transfer agreements, letters of intent, property authorization forms. Every one carried some version of my forged signature. Some even included notarization stamps. The sheer confidence behind the fraud left me speechless. Someone hadn't merely discussed taking my land. They had already begun creating the paperwork to make it appear as though I had willingly agreed. How long? I finally asked. How long has this been happening? Darius looked out the windshield before answering. At least a year. A full year. While I invited Vanessa to Sunday dinners. While we celebrated birthdays together. While I congratulated them on their engagement and helped plan their wedding. Another plan had been unfolding beneath every smile and every family photograph. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but the anger rising inside me had nothing to do with money. It was the realization that they had already decided my opinion didn't matter. They had never intended to negotiate, never intended to ask. In their minds, I was simply an old widower standing between them and a fortune. Darius remained silent until I looked back at him. Then he reached for the phone one last time and said quietly, "Dad, everything I've shown you so far only explains what they want." He paused, his expression hardening. "The next file explains how they planned to make sure you couldn't stop them." For several moments, neither of us spoke. I kept staring at the forged documents, trying to understand how an ordinary family had found itself caught inside something that looked more like an organized business operation than a broken engagement. Then Darius quietly locked his phone and leaned back in his seat. "Dad, there's one thing I need you to understand." I looked at him. "I never intended to marry Vanessa." That sentence hit me almost as hard as everything I had already seen. "What do you mean?" He took a slow breath before answering. 3 months ago, I was ready to end the relationship. I had already started noticing things that didn't make sense. Every conversation somehow returned to the farm. Every argument somehow became about your future. Every time we visited you, Vanessa asked questions that had nothing to do with family. I remembered those visits. I remembered thinking she was simply trying to understand the life her future husband came from. Instead, she had been collecting information, one conversation at a time. "So why didn't you leave?" I asked. Darius looked down at his hands. "Because walking away would have protected them, not us." I frowned. He unlocked another folder filled with neatly organized files. Every recording carried a date. Every screenshot had been cataloged. Every photograph included the exact time and location where it had been taken. It looked less like the phone of a groom and more like the evidence locker of a detective. "The day I confronted them without proof," he said calmly, "they would have deleted everything. The emails would disappear. The documents would be destroyed. The recordings would never exist. They would tell everyone I was jealous, paranoid, or trying to escape the wedding." He wasn't guessing. He had thought through every possible outcome. "So I smiled," he continued. "I went to dinner with them. I helped plan the wedding. I acted excited whenever they talked about the future. Every time they believed I trusted them a little more, they became a little less careful. Suddenly, I understood why the recording sounded so natural. Vanessa had never imagined Darius was listening. She believed she had already won. Confidence had made her careless. Darius opened another audio file. This time, Vanessa was speaking with a close friend during lunch. Her voice was relaxed, almost amused. "Honestly, Raymond is easier to manage than I expected." The friend laughed. "You mean Darius?" Vanessa answered immediately. "No. The son asks too many questions. The father still believes people are basically honest. That's why this works." The recording stopped, but the words continued echoing inside my head. Easier to manage. As though I were a business problem, instead of the father of the man she claimed to love. I felt anger building inside me, yet Darius remained remarkably calm. "That conversation changed everything," he said quietly. "It wasn't just about the land anymore. It proved they never saw either of us as family. I finally understood the burden my son had been carrying alone for months. Every smile he forced during wedding planning, every dinner he attended, every photograph he posed for beside Vanessa. None of it had been real. He had been sacrificing his own peace of mind to gather enough evidence to protect both of us. Most people would have exploded in anger. Others would have quietly disappeared. My son had done something far more difficult. He had stayed patient. He had allowed arrogant people to expose themselves completely. "So what's next?" I asked. Darius reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully placed a small flash drive in my hand. "Tomorrow is the wedding," he said, looking directly into my eyes. "The Hartwells think tomorrow is the day they finally take everything from us." He paused just long enough for the weight of those words to settle between us before adding, "They're walking into that ballroom expecting a celebration. What they're actually walking into is the day the truth becomes impossible to hide." I drove back to my hotel sometime after midnight, but sleep never came. The flash drive Darius had placed in my hand remained untouched on the bedside table because I already knew it contained enough evidence to destroy an entire family. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Vanessa laughing about how easily I could be manipulated. Every time I opened them, I saw my father's land sitting in the middle of that highway corridor. By sunrise, I had reached one conclusion. This wasn't just about protecting 32 acres anymore. It was about protecting my family's name from people who believed honesty was nothing more than a weakness waiting to be exploited. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Darius called and asked me to meet him at his apartment before heading to the wedding venue. When I arrived, the living room looked less like a home than a command center. Laptops covered the dining table. Projectors, cables, speakers, portable hard drives, and backup batteries were neatly arranged across the floor. Another man stood beside the equipment checking connections. "Dad, this is Devin," Darius said. "We've been friends since college." Devin shook my hand with a calm smile. "I've handled audiovisual systems for corporate conferences and legal presentations for years. Today won't be any different, except the audience has no idea what they're about to watch." He clicked a key on his laptop, and a massive presentation appeared on the wall. I expected a collection of random files. Instead, I saw something astonishing. Every recording, every email, every forged document, every photograph, and every video had been organized into a precise sequence. Each piece of evidence led naturally to the next. Every accusation was immediately supported by proof before another revelation appeared. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't theatrical. It was methodical. It looked exactly like the presentation a prosecutor would deliver to a jury. "You've been planning this for a long time," I said quietly. Darius nodded. "Weeks. Maybe longer if I'm being honest." Devin switched between slides, carefully checking that every audio clip played correctly and every document appeared in the proper order. "If even one file fails," he explained, "someone can claim the presentation was manipulated. Everything has to work perfectly." I stood silently, watching them prepare. The more I observed, the more I realized this had never been about humiliating Vanessa. If humiliation had been the goal, Darius could have exposed the recordings months earlier. Instead, he had spent weeks building an undeniable chain of evidence that left no room for excuses or confusion. "The venue approved all this equipment?" I asked. Devin laughed softly. "They think we're setting up a surprise video for the bride." For the first time since entering the apartment, I smiled. The irony was almost unbelievable. The Hartwells believed they were walking into the happiest day of their lives. In reality, they were walking into the exact moment every lie they had carefully constructed would collapse in front of everyone they had spent years trying to impress. Darius continued reviewing the sequence one last time. The recordings would play first, allowing guests to hear Vanessa's own words before seeing any documents. Next would come the county maps, proving the value of the land. Then the emails connecting Preston to the acquisition strategy. Finally, the forged signatures and timeline, showing that plans to seize my property had begun months before Darius had even proposed. Every reveal answered the questions created by the previous one. There were no gaps, no assumptions, only facts. I looked at my son and saw none of the anger I expected. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. You can still cancel everything, I said. Walk away from the wedding. Let the police handle the rest. He looked at me for several seconds before slowly shaking his head. If I disappear quietly, they become victims. They'll tell everyone I got cold feet. They'll move on, find another family, another opportunity, another piece of land. He paused before adding, "This ends today because it has to end today." There was nothing left for me to say. The decision had already been made. Around noon, Devon packed the final projector into its case, while Darius placed the flash drive containing every piece of evidence inside his jacket pocket. As we prepared to leave, my son stopped beside the apartment door and looked directly at me. "Dad, no matter what happens once this starts, don't interrupt it. Don't try to protect me. Just let the truth finish what it came to do." The certainty in his voice told me he already knew exactly how explosive the next few hours were about to become. By the time we stepped outside and headed toward the wedding venue, I realized none of us were driving to a ceremony anymore. We were driving toward a courtroom disguised as a celebration. The ceremony began exactly at 2 o'clock that afternoon. By then, every chair inside the ballroom had been filled. Family members, old friends, business associates, neighbors, and people who had traveled from 3 different states chatted happily while waiting for the music to begin. Looking around the room, I realized not a single person had the slightest idea they weren't about to witness a wedding. The Hartwells certainly didn't. Preston moved confidently through the crowd, shaking hands as though he had already completed the most successful business deal of his life. Claire smiled gracefully for photographs, accepting compliments about the beautiful ceremony, while making certain every important guest noticed her. Vanessa looked radiant in her white gown. She greeted relatives with effortless charm, kissed old friends on the cheek, and carried herself with the confidence of a woman who believed every detail of her future had already been secured. Only Darius looked different. Standing beside the officiant, he wasn't smiling, but he wasn't nervous either. His face revealed nothing. I had watched that expression before. It was the same look he wore whenever he had already made an irreversible decision. As the music changed, everyone rose to their feet. Preston proudly escorted Vanessa down the aisle while dozens of phones recorded what appeared to be the perfect beginning of a perfect marriage. Watching them walk toward the altar, I realized something strange. They weren't walking toward a future. They were walking toward the exact moment their past would catch up with them. When Vanessa finally reached Darius, she squeezed his hand and smiled with complete confidence. The officiant welcomed everyone, spoke about love, trust, and lifelong commitment, and the ceremony unfolded exactly as everyone expected. Then came the question that changed everything. "Darius Cobb," the officiant said warmly, "do you take Vanessa Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Silence settled across the ballroom. Vanessa looked into my son's eyes, waiting for the answer she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times. Instead, Darius calmly removed his microphone from the stand and faced the audience. "Before I answer," he said evenly, "everyone here deserves to know who is really standing at this altar." Confused whispers spread through the room. Vanessa's smile disappeared almost instantly. Preston straightened in his chair. Claire frowned toward the back of the ballroom where Devon quietly stepped into the audiovisual booth. A second later, the enormous projection screen behind the stage came to life. At first, guests saw only a restaurant security image. Then the speakers filled the room with Vanessa's unmistakable voice. 6 more weeks. After that, everything gets easier. Conversations stopped immediately. Heads turned from the screen toward the bride and back again. The recording continued. "Once we're married, I'll start working on the property situation. Dad already has buyers interested." Several guests exchanged puzzled looks. Others frowned, clearly unsure what they were hearing. Then, Claire's recorded voice asked the question that erased every remaining doubt. "And what if his father refuses?" Vanessa laughed softly before answering. "He won't. Men like him trust their sons." That's what makes this so easy. The ballroom fell completely silent. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody whispered. It felt as though the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Vanessa's face drained of color. "Darius," she whispered, "turn this off." He didn't even look at her. Not yet. The second presentation began immediately. Maps appeared showing the proposed highway expansion. Red lines crossed directly through my property, while projected land values multiplied across the screen. Guests leaned forward in their seats as the connection slowly became clear. Before anyone could process what they had just seen, emails appeared linking Preston Hartwell to confidential development discussions months before Darius and Vanessa announced their engagement. Then came the forged documents. My name filled the screen beside signatures that looked almost identical to my own. Darius held up the original documents for everyone to see, before a handwriting comparison highlighted dozens of differences, proving every signature had been fabricated. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. One elderly guest quietly said, "My God," while another shook his head in disbelief. Preston suddenly jumped to his feet. "This is fabricated," he shouted. "Every bit of it is fake." Darius calmly nodded toward Devon. Another video immediately began playing. This time Preston himself appeared inside his office speaking with another developer. His voice filled the ballroom. "The Cobb property is the priority. Once we control that land, the rest of the corridor becomes easy." Nobody needed an explanation anymore. The room understood. The engagement had never created a business opportunity. The business opportunity had created the engagement. Vanessa grabbed Darius's arm desperately. "Please, we can explain this." He gently removed her hand. "You had nearly 2 years to explain the truth." Tears streamed down her face. But for the first time since meeting her, they weren't tears of heartbreak. They were tears from watching complete control disappear in front of hundreds of witnesses. Claire lowered her head into her hands. Preston looked around the ballroom, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him. Nobody moved. The people who had applauded the Hartwells only minutes earlier now avoided looking at them altogether. The carefully rehearsed wedding had transformed into something none of us could have imagined. It was no longer a ceremony celebrating love. It had become a public trial where the defendants had convicted themselves using nothing but their own words. And just when I believed the worst was finally over, a calm voice rose from the third row and changed the entire afternoon forever. For several long seconds after the final slide disappeared, nobody in the ballroom moved. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. Hundreds of people sat frozen, trying to process the realization that they hadn't just witnessed a broken engagement. They had witnessed evidence of a carefully planned conspiracy. Then the room exploded. Conversations erupted in every direction. Chairs scraped across the floor. Guests stood, pointing toward the screen, while others hurried to replay what they had just recorded on their phones. Preston Hartwell reacted first. His face burned red with anger as he stormed toward the audiovisual booth. "Turn that damn projector off," he shouted. "This presentation is fraudulent." Devon remained inside the locked control room without saying a word. There was no reason to respond. The evidence had already been seen. Nothing Preston said could erase it now. He spun back toward Darius, his fingers shaking with rage. "You've destroyed your own future." Darius didn't raise his voice. "No. I stopped you from destroying someone else's." That single sentence silenced Preston far more effectively than any argument could have. Claire slowly stood from her chair, looking around the ballroom, as though searching for one familiar face willing to support her. Instead, she found guests quietly stepping away. People who had spent years admiring the Hartwell family suddenly wanted nothing to do with them. Vanessa looked completely lost. Her makeup was streaked with tears, her hands trembled uncontrollably, and every attempt to speak ended before the words reached her lips. She took 2 hesitant steps toward Darius. "Please. We don't have to do this here." He looked at her with genuine sadness rather than anger. "You decided where this would end the day you turned our family into a business transaction." Before Vanessa could answer, a calm voice rose from the third row. "Excuse me." The entire ballroom instinctively turned toward the speaker. A middle-aged man in a dark suit slowly stood and adjusted his jacket. "My name is Alton Burke," he said evenly. "I'm an assistant district attorney for Harris County, and I attended today's ceremony as a personal guest of the Cobb family." Every conversation stopped instantly. Even Preston remained silent. Alton glanced briefly toward the frozen presentation screen before looking directly at the Hartwells. Based on the evidence presented today, I strongly advise the individuals involved not to leave this building. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Those words transformed everything. Until that moment, many guests had still believed they were witnessing an ugly family dispute. Now they understood this had become a criminal investigation. Preston recovered just enough confidence to step forward. "You can't seriously believe this circus proves anything." Alton met his eyes without the slightest emotion. No presentation proves a criminal case by itself. However, forged signatures, recorded conversations discussing fraudulent acquisitions, confidential planning documents, and coordinated financial activity certainly justify immediate investigation. Preston opened his mouth to argue again, but stopped. For the first time all afternoon he looked uncertain. He finally understood that influence, expensive lawyers, and public reputation might not be enough this time. Vanessa quietly turned toward one of the side exits. She had barely taken a few steps before three of Darius's closest friends casually moved into the aisle. None of them touched her. None of them blocked her physically. They simply stood there, making it unmistakably clear that walking away before authorities arrived would only make matters worse. Vanessa lowered her head and slowly returned to her chair. I watched her shoulders collapse as the confidence she had carried for nearly 2 years disappeared completely. Around 20 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened once again. This time it wasn't late-arriving guests entering. 2 uniformed police officers walked inside, followed by several investigators carrying evidence bags and document cases. The lively wedding venue became as quiet as a courtroom awaiting a verdict. One investigator spoke briefly with Alton before approaching Darius. My son calmly handed over the flash drive, containing every recording, email, photograph, video, and document he had collected over the previous 3 months. There was no dramatic speech, no celebration, only facts changing hands from one honest man to another. As investigators began securing copies of the evidence, I looked around the ballroom one final time. Just 24 hours earlier, Vanessa had laughed because she believed I was nothing more than an old handyman standing in the way of her family's fortune. Now the same room that had laughed at me stood in complete silence while law enforcement carefully documented the beginning of the Hartwells' downfall. I thought the hardest part of this nightmare was finally over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Once investigators started examining the evidence, they would uncover a pattern far larger than any of us had imagined. The wedding ended that afternoon, but for our family, the real battle was only beginning. Within 48 hours, investigators had copied every recording, every email, every video, and every forged document Darius had spent months collecting. What had shocked a ballroom full of wedding guests now became evidence in an official criminal investigation. I was interviewed several times over the following weeks, each conversation forcing me to relive moments I would rather have forgotten. Handwriting specialists compared my genuine signature with the ones attached to the property documents and reached the same conclusion I already knew. Every one of them had been forged. Digital forensic experts authenticated the audio recordings, confirming they had not been edited or manipulated. County officials verified that confidential planning documents concerning the highway expansion had been circulating long before any public announcement. Piece by piece, the case stopped being about suspicion and became about proof. The deeper investigators looked into the Hartwells' finances, the clearer everything became. Behind the expensive clothes, luxury cars, and elegant charity events was a family drowning in debt. Failed investments had left enormous financial holes. Loans had been extended again and again until creditors began demanding repayment. My farm wasn't simply an attractive investment. It had been their escape plan. If they could gain control before the highway project became public, the increase in value would erase years of financial disaster almost overnight. Understanding their motive didn't make me feel sympathy. It only explained why they had been willing to sacrifice another family to save themselves. Then the investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. Several people contacted authorities after hearing about the failed wedding. One woman described a relationship with a business associate connected to Preston that had slowly shifted toward discussions about inherited property and family assets before she ended it. Another family reported suspicious offers involving privately owned land that closely resembled the tactics used against us. None of those cases were identical, but together they revealed a pattern that prosecutors could no longer ignore. This had never been a single desperate decision. It was a method that had simply failed when it reached my son. Nearly 6 months after the wedding, before the case reached trial, attorneys representing the Hartwells requested a private settlement meeting. Darius and I sat across the conference table while their legal team presented what they called a practical solution. They offered a substantial financial payment, complete ownership protection for my property, written public apologies, and confidential agreements that would end the criminal proceedings if we cooperated. The amount they placed on the table was more money than I had ever imagined possessing. For a brief moment, I looked at the document and thought about how much easier life could become. Then I remembered Vanessa laughing in the hotel lobby. I remembered Preston discussing my family's land as though it were already his. Most of all, I remembered my son pretending to smile through months of lies, simply to protect me. I slowly closed the folder and slid it back across the table. The lead attorney looked surprised. "Mr. Cobb, may I ask why you're refusing such a generous offer?" I met his eyes without hesitation. Because this was never about money. He waited for more. "If we sell justice today," I continued, "someone else's family becomes tomorrow's target." The room fell silent. Even the attorneys understood there was nothing left to negotiate. The meeting ended less than 10 minutes later. Several months afterward, the trial finally began. Prosecutors built the case exactly the way Darius had built his presentation at the wedding. One fact supporting the next, until every piece connected into a single, undeniable picture. Recordings matched emails. Emails matched financial transactions. Financial records matched forged documents. Expert witnesses confirmed every technical detail. By the time closing arguments arrived, I looked across the courtroom at Preston Hartwell. The confidence that had once filled every room he entered had completely disappeared. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked like a man who finally understood that there are some consequences no amount of money, influence, or reputation can buy your way out of. The verdict was delivered nearly a year after the wedding that never happened. By then, the headlines had faded, television cameras had moved on, and the courtroom was filled only with the people whose lives had been permanently changed by the truth. The jury needed very little time to reach its decision. The evidence had spoken long before the lawyers finished their closing arguments. Preston Hartwell received the longest sentence for his role in the conspiracy, the forged documents, and the coordinated attempt to obtain my property through fraud. Claire was convicted for knowingly participating in the scheme and helping conceal critical evidence. Vanessa stood silently as the judge read her sentence. She never looked toward Darius. She never looked toward me. The confidence that had once filled every room she entered had disappeared completely. For the first time since I had met her nearly 2 years earlier, I wasn't looking at a woman who believed she could manipulate every situation. I was looking at someone finally forced to live with the consequences of her own decisions. When we walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, Darius and I didn't celebrate. There was no victory speech, no satisfaction in watching another family fall apart. Justice had been served, but justice never brings back the months stolen by deception or the trust destroyed by betrayal. We simply stood together on the courthouse steps for a few moments before driving home. As we crossed the county line, I rolled down the truck window and watched the familiar fields pass by. The farm looked exactly as it always had. The fences still stretched across the hills. The old pecan trees still cast their afternoon shadows across the front pasture. My father's barn still stood proudly against the western sky. For the first time in a long while, it truly felt like home again. Life gradually found its rhythm. Darius returned to managing land conservation projects, but he spent far more weekends working beside me than he ever had before. We repaired fences together, replaced the roof on the equipment shed, and planted another row of pecan trees where a storm had damaged the old ones years earlier. We talked more than we ever had before, not because the investigation had changed us, but because it reminded us how easily tomorrow can be taken for granted. About a year after the trial ended, Darius introduced me to someone new. Her name was Tanya. She was a soil scientist from a nearby university who loved quiet mornings, old family recipes, and getting her boots dirty in the fields. During her very first visit, she didn't ask how many acres we owned. She didn't ask whether developers had contacted us. She didn't ask about property values, taxes, or future investments. Instead, she noticed an old photograph of Lorraine hanging above the fireplace and smiled. "Darius told me your wife made the best pecan pie in the county," she said. "Would you teach me how she made it?" That simple question told me more about Tanya than 2 years of conversations had ever told me about Vanessa. A few months later, Darius and Tanya were married beneath the oldest pecan trees on our farm. There was no luxury hotel, no grand ballroom, and no expensive performance designed to impress strangers. Just family, close friends, honest laughter, and promises made for the right reasons. As the evening sun disappeared behind the fields, I found myself thinking back to the moment Vanessa had laughed in that hotel lobby and called me the handyman. For a few painful seconds, I had questioned my own worth because of someone else's opinion. I understand now that her insult had never defined me. It had exposed her. People who measure others by wealth, status, or appearances almost always reveal far more about themselves than the people they judge. The land my grandfather fought to protect still carries our family name. My wife's memories still live inside this house. My son built a future with someone who values people before possessions. And every evening, when I sit on the front porch watching the sun settle beyond the fields, I'm reminded of one lesson this journey gave me that I will never forget. The truth rarely arrives when we want it to, but when it finally does, it doesn't ask for permission. It simply walks through the front door, and nothing built on lies can stand in its way.